In the 12th year of his reign, which was 1669, 9th of April 1669 to be precise, Aurangzeb issued a general order. Well, Aurangzeb being Aurangzeb, the order was to demolish all the schools and temples of the infidels. Of course, in order to put a stop to the religious teaching and the religious practices. To quote Jadunath Sarkar, Aurangzeb's destroying hand now fell on the great shrines that commanded the veneration of the Hindus all over India, such as the second temple of Somnath, built by the pious zeal of Bhimdev soon after the deconstruction of the older and more famous one at the hands of Mahmud of Ghazni, the Vishwanath Temple of Banaras and the Keshav Rai Temple of Mathura. And once Aurangzeb had given this order to demolish all these temples, the local Muslims of the area came to know about it, and with the help of a local official, whose name was Muhammad Afzal, they tried to demolish the Somnath Temple. Along with Muhammad Afzal's troops, the local Muslims attacked the Somnath Temple. But as soon as the news got out, the Hindus of the area, the Desais, the Brahmins, the Mahajans, they all rushed to the spot and they asked the Muslims not to do this. A Muslim official who was present over there, whose name was Malik Zia, he insulted the Hindus and he slaughtered a cow in response. So when the Hindus asked these Muslims not to demolish their place of worship, they responded by killing a cow on the spot. After that, he killed a Brahmin and a priest, a Pandit of the temple as well. And in response, a fight erupted, and the Muslim official, Malik Zia, was killed on the spot by Ganpat Desai. Very quickly, the Muslims realized that the whole town had stood up against them and that the Hindus were truly angry. So they immediately ran away and that they left that place. In 1706, the Somnath Temple was converted into a mosque. For 241 years, the temple remained as a mosque, and at some point it was abandoned till after the independence or after the transfer of power to the Congress Party in 1947. On 12th of November 1947, Sardar Patel visited the Somnath Temple because it was the day of Diwali. And on that day, during that visit, he propped up the idea that the Somnath Temple be restored to its former glory. And of course, immediately, there was a lot of excitement. Throughout the country, there was a new energy at the idea of this incredible, this ancient, this very important temple being restored. And as soon as the excitement began about this project, so did the opposition to it. The foremost voice of opposition was from Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, the first education minister of India. Ironically, he never went to school a single day in his life. He was born in Saudi Arabia and he studied only in madrasas. So as soon as Sardar Patel had given the idea to restore the Somnath Temple, Mr. Azad immediately protested against it. Mr. Azad said that the historical ruins of the Somnath Temple should be handed over to the Archaeological Survey of India, and that this society, this organization, should maintain it as a historical monument. Right on cue, the leftist archaeologists, the historians, they also started their opposition to the construction, to the restoration of this historical temple, because they claimed that history was being destroyed. The combined argument was that the history should be preserved, that the restoration of a very, very important place of worship for the majority Hindu community was a very, very bad idea. Of course, when it came to the maintenance and the restoration of the Muslim places, like the Maqbaras, the tombs, or the Mazars, they had no problem with that, because it was very important for the government of Mr. Nehru. Because you see, in the aftermath of the partition, when the Hindus and Sikhs poured in from the present temporary country of Pakistan, they had to take shelter in open spaces because there was no place to accommodate them, no arrangements had been made. So they took shelter in and around the open places of Delhi, like the Purana Killa, the Safdarjung tomb, and the Humayun's tomb. And when all these people were camped, then of course these places became dirty, and this angered Mr. Nehru. The manicured lawns and the beautiful fountains were spoiled, and Mr. Nehru was very angry about it. So he immediately issued an order to evict all these refugee Hindus and Sikhs, all these people who had lost family members, who had lost their houses, their money, their belongings, and taken shelter in the newly formed India. All these people were ordered to be evicted from the Mughal monuments as soon as possible, and the restoration work of these places was taken up, assigned to a specialized department of the government, that a Hindu monument be restored after almost 3 centuries of being converted into a mosque and being left ignored was of no importance to this government. Shortly after this, Sardar Patel passed away, and the restoration of the Somnath, that project was passed on to Mr. KM Munshi. To understand what Mr. Munshi thought about the project, first we should know a little bit about him. Mr. Munshi was a member of the Congress party, and he was a cabinet minister in the government of Mr. Nehru. So it might seem like he was also a member of the corrupt Nehru cabal, just another astute follower of the Gandhian philosophy. But luckily, that wasn't the case, because Mr. Munshi was a follower of Sri Aurobindo, because of whom he had joined the revolutionary movement against the British rule. Mr. Munshi was also an author. He was also the founder of the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad. And I think that should give you a pretty clear idea of what kind of person this was. So luckily for the Hindus, the task of restoring the Somnath Temple fell into his hands. And about that he writes, "I was clear in my mind that the Temple of Somnath was not just an ancient monument, it lived in the heart of the whole nation, and its reconstruction was a national pledge." As strong as Mr. Munshi's passion for the restoration of the Somnath Temple was, equally strong was Mr. Nehru's opposition to it, because Mr. Nehru never liked the idea of restoring this ancient monument, and he constantly criticized Mr. Munshi for being a part of the project for its reconstruction. Such was the stigma attached to this that in the political scene of New Delhi, Mr. Munshi was known as that man who's connected with the Somnath Temple. Nonetheless, in 1949, a trust was formed to oversee the project. The foundation stone was laid in 1950, and the remnants of the pre-existing mosque were removed, and for them a new mosque was created nearby. The new temple design was made by Prabhashankar Sompura, whose family had been building temples in Gujarat for centuries, and it is his grandson who is designing the currently under construction temple in Ayodhya. The temple was built in a Chalukyan style, and they try to incorporate as much remains of the ancient temple into the new construction as possible. While this was going on, the ruler of Jamnagar, Digvijay Singh Ji, he was also a trustee in the Somnath Trust. He donated the big sum of 1 lakh rupees towards the temple construction fund. Along with this, he also wrote letters to Indian diplomats abroad. He requested the diplomats to send a pinch of soil, a few drops of water, and some twigs from the countries in which they were posted in to be used in the construction of this temple, so that it could symbolize the unity of the world and the brotherhood of men. While it was a great idea, it was a very noble idea, but it had a terrible side effect, because this made the construction of the temple a very international issue. And immediately, many diplomats who were, of course, a part of the Nehru government, they opposed the idea. This also turned out to be another chance for Mr. Nehru, who was already unhappy about this project from day one, to be even angrier. Because at this point, when this issue was internationalized, Nehru thought that the reputation of India as a secular state had been jeopardized internationally. He immediately cautioned Mr. Munshi, who chose to tread carefully and drop the idea. Now you have to remember that at this point in India's history, Gandhi had died, Sardar Patel had passed away, so Nehru was the top dog. He was the all-powerful guy, And he was treated like a demigod by his minions, by his cabinet ministers, by everybody in New Delhi. So just as the temple was going to be inaugurated, in the early months of 1951, Nehru called Mr. Munshi, and he told Mr. Munshi in clear words that he did not like the idea of restoring Somnath because it was Hindu revivalism. The first Prime Minister of so-called independent India did not like the restoration of a very, very important monument, a very important part of Hindu history, because it would lead to Hindu revivalism. The cards were on the table. Mr. Nehru could not even hide behind the false facade of secularism. He was clearly anti-Hindu. At this suggestion, Mr. Munshi was so angry that he left the meeting and chose to reply to Mr. Nehru via a letter that he wrote the next day. There's one very prominent paragraph in the letter that I'll recite for you now. Mr. Munshi writes, "Yesterday you referred to Hindu revivalism. I know your views on the subject. I have done justice to them. I hope you will equally do justice to mine. It is my faith in the past which has given me the strength to work in the present and to look forward to our future. I cannot value freedom if it deprives us of the Bhagavad Gita or uproots our millions from the faith with which they look upon our temples and thereby destroy the texture of our lives. This shrine, once restored to a place of importance in our life, will give to our people a pure conception of religion and a more vivid consciousness of our strength, so vital in these days of freedom and its trail." And with that letter, Mr. Munshi gave a befitting reply to PM Nehru. But Mr. Nehru was still not convinced. When the temple was to be inaugurated, the President of India, Mr. Rajendra Prasad, was invited, but as expected, Mr. Nehru was not happy about that at all. In fact, he was very against the idea. Nehru wrote a letter to the President, and he said, "I confess that I do not like the idea of your associating yourself with the spectacular opening of the Somnath Temple. This is not merely visiting a temple, which can certainly be done by you or anyone else, but rather participating in a significant function which unfortunately has a number of implications." So in no uncertain terms, the Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, told the President that inaugurating this great Hindu temple would of course challenge the secular fabric of the Indian Republic, a phrase the Hindus of this country would hear decade after decade. You could even say that this was the first instance of the secular fabric of the country coming under threat. And this was also perhaps the first seeds of secularism or secularism that sprouted, and the first fruit to ripen was vote bank politics. Because it's very clear that Mr. Nehru did not want the president to go and inaugurate the Somnath Temple because it would annoy the Muslim community of the country. And since they were an important vote bank for Mr. Nehru, I mean, given the way Hindus had suffered during the partition, Mr. Nehru probably wasn't sure if they would vote for him in a real election. Because the first time Mr. Nehru was elected as a prime minister, there was no elections. In fact, even the little voting that happened within Congress, Mr. Nehru had lost that to Sardar Patel. And it was only at the insistence of Mohandas Gandhi that he was made the prime minister. So perhaps Mr. Nehru wasn't sure that if a real election was to happen, he would win or not. Nonetheless, he shot off this letter to the president. But just like Mr. Munshi, President Rajendra Prasad also did not really care. He simply ignored Nehru's advice, and he said that he would have done the same thing if a mosque or a church was to be inaugurated, singing to the tune of Nehru's much coveted secular politics. But Mr. Nehru still wasn't done. After being snubbed by Mr. Munshi and President Rajendra Prasad, Nehru wrote a letter to all the chief ministers of India dated May the 2nd, 1951, and he told all of them to not associate with the Somnath Temple and to not attend the inauguration ceremony. And given his stature in the country at that point, many of these chief ministers did oblige him. On 11th of May 1951, the President of India inaugurated the Somnath Temple, the newly restored Somnath Temple, and during his speech, he made many very important points. The President said that he was proud that in spite of many physical symbols of our civilization getting destroyed, the bond that our people had with their Sanskriti, with their dharma, was not. And in his words, as long as that bond remained, this civilization would survive. And it was this urge for civilizational renewal because of which that this restoration of the Somnath Temple became possible, which was important because Somnath was the symbol of economic and spiritual prosperity of ancient India, that the rebuilding of Somnath would not be complete till India attains the prosperity of the yesteryears. While the speech was covered by the press, it was completely ignored by the government bodies and the government ministries for obvious reasons. It was thus that the idea of the restoration of the Somnath Temple came out of the mind of Sardar Patel and was made possible by the unstoppable efforts of KM Munshi, and thus was restored the great pride of our Indic civilization. Mr. Nehru, by the way, did change his mind regarding ancient monuments and ancient shrines because he donated some land for the construction of a pilgrim center. Not for a Hindu cause, of course, but it was for Buddhist travelers, international Buddhist travelers who would come to Sarnath. And he also provided some grants for the restoration of Sarnath. So you could say that this was as close as Mr. Nehru would ever come at acknowledging and perhaps respecting the culture of his own people. It wasn't long after that Mr. Munshi left the Congress party and he started the Akhand Hindustan movement and founded the Swatantrata Party, which was a nationalistic Hindu party. Years later, Mr. Munshi would write about the Somnath restoration movement, in which he would brutally criticize the idea of Nehruvian secularism. Mr. Munshi writes, "In the name of secularism, anti-religious forces sponsored by secular humanism or communism condemns religious piety, particularly in the majority community. In its name, minorities are immune from such attention and have succeeded in getting their demands, however unreasonable. In its name again, politicians in power adopt a strange attitude which, while it condones the susceptibilities, religious and social, of the minority communities, is too ready to brand similar susceptibilities in the majority community as communalistic and reactionary. How secularism sometimes becomes allergic to Hinduism will be apparent from certain episodes relating to the reconstruction of Somnath Temple. These unfortunate postures have been creating a sense of frustration in the majority community. If, however, the misuse of this word secularism continues, if every time there is an intercommunal conflict, the majority is blamed regardless of the merits of the questions, if our holy places of pilgrimage, like Banaras, Mathura and Rishikesh, continue to be converted into industrial slums, the springs of traditional tolerance will dry up." And this was written by Mr. Munshi in the 60s. And as we have seen since then, his words have unfortunately come true. I hope you have enjoyed listening to this and you've gained a new insight into a very important point in the modern history of the Hindus. If you have any feedback, any critique, please send me a message on Instagram. Let me know your thoughts about this podcast. Till the next time I see you.